It is my pleasure this morning to welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Matthew Spalding. He is the director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies at Heritage Foundation. He is a constitutional scholar, that just sets my heart a beating fast, because Jamestown, of course, was the start of everything we do governmentally. An authority on American political thought and religious liberty. He is the author of 4 books and a graduate of Claremont McKenna College. Anyone know where that is? I think it's in California, yeah. He earned a doctorate degree in government from Claremont Graduate School. As a teacher, he's taught American government at George Mason University, the Catholic University of America. I have a master's degree from there. That's my alma maters. And Claremont McKenna College. He's an adjunct fellow of the Kirby Center at Hillsdale College. And in 2006, he was awarded the prestigious W. Glenn and Rita Ricardo Campbell Award from the Heritage Foundation for his editorial work on the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. It's a big deal. We are pleased this morning to have him and honored to have him with us. Please help me welcome Dr. Matthew Spalding.
Morning, thank you. It's good to be with you. I'm very happy to be here with Morton and his bride here as well. They're actually very close friends to my in-laws, Lee and Ann Edwards, and knew them for a long time, and my wife, Elizabeth, or their daughter, soon to be my wife, Elizabeth, long before I did. So they've gratefully accepted me into the family of conservatism that exists here. But I'm very happy to be here. I've also done many things with the Leadership Institute, and it's salute its fine work, very important work in many things that need to be done to save our country. I want to put it in what's going on in a much broader context and talk about history for a little bit, because I think that's actually what's going on right now, which is a battle between two worldviews of how to understand very important questions. But let me begin by doing so by telling a story. One of the stories in my book that I discovered this, and about a young man who I'm trying to turn in. One of my objectives is to turn this person into a American patriotic history hero of American history. A young man named Levi Preston, who fought at the Battle of Concord. But for a interview he later gave with a historian, he would be forgotten. But he fights the Battle of Concord, which, as you recall, is the battle after the British leave Boston, occupied Boston, go through Lexington, and they go to Concord looking for munitions that are hidden there. Levi Preston's a young man, unmarried, goes up and shows up at the famous bridge, the Battle of Concord. And so he's interviewed a few years later by a historian who asked him why he went and fought. Now, for those of us who are here and have the gift of hindsight, that doesn't seem to be that important of a question. But you see, we have hindsight, which is to say we know what happened. We know why the Battle of Concord became the Battle of Concord. Levi Preston, or anybody who was there at the time, didn't know that. Indeed, what they knew was that afternoon, or that late morning going into the afternoon, they were going out to fight against the best armed, best trained, best prepared military force in the world, who had sent out a large group of military, included mounted cavalry, and you were going out there with about 100, 150 or so of your friends who were untrained, and most of you had guns left over from the French and Indian War. So it made it an important question. Why did you go out and fight at the Battle of Concord? And so the historian asked, well, surely it was the Stamp Act. You objected to the Stamp Act, isn't that right? To which Preston replied, no, I didn't bother you that much, actually. Well, the historian said, surely it was the tea tax. You objected to the tea tax. I didn't drink tea. Besides, the boys all threw it in the harbor. Well, what about all those books, the historian asked? Surely you read John Locke and Algernon Sidney and all the great works of Republican theory. Sorry, I didn't read any of those books. I read the Almanac, I read the Bible, I read the Psalms, that's about it. To which the frustrated historian said, Why did you go out and fight the Battle of Concord? To which Preston turned to him and said, look, it was actually quite simple. You see, we had always governed ourselves, and we always intended to govern ourselves, and those redcoats, well, they didn't think that we should. End of interview. I think that's just a wonderful story, and it encapsulates everything. American history is often thought to be very complicated, nuanced, with all sorts of meanings. Too much for us to understand unless you went to an Ivy League university and got a PhD. But it turns out that's actually not the case. Great turning points in history, of which Concord was one, usually turn on very simple things, core fundamental concepts of meaning. And here we have Levi Preston, who hadn't studied political theory, who probably wasn't involved in most of the events of the day leading up to that, but who knew in his gut, literally, that something important was going on, and it had something to do with a core concept of what America came to stand for, namely self-government. I would suggest to you today we are at one of those turning points, as important as the events of that day. What's significant is, like those turning points, we do not have the gift of hindsight yet, which is to say we do not know what's going to happen. But we know something extremely important is going on, and we know why we need to be involved for the right reasons. There's a battle going on right now, and it's over this question of self-government. Many other things as well, but it comes down to this very simple idea. And that's a battle between the founders' view of self-government, the worldview of our founders, and the worldview of modern progressive liberalism, which is a different thing. The founders' worldview we probably know pretty well. Most Americans, turns out, actually know it somewhat well, much better than we might think, given their lack of study of history and knowledge of particulars. But their instincts and their sentiments are actually quite sound. We know those things, the founders' views, from two documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Two sides of a coin. You got to have them both. We are fundamentally equal because we are created equal, and we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. If that's true, those rights come from nature, not from government. The only way to proceed fairly is by the consent of the governed. That's the theory of the American founding in a nutshell. Consent means we have to agree to the rules, the framework. It means the rule of law. And the way the rule of law is chosen to be expounded in America is through a written constitution. The first ever to have a written constitution. British do not have one, did not have one. And you can go back in history and find a few things written down here or there, but nothing that equals our American Constitution. It's an innovation. Out of that conception of rights, we each have rights to the fruits of our labor. Right? We are equal in terms of our citizenship. We equally have opportunity. And the framework of government, the Constitution, which keeps government limited, it protects those opportunities. It tears down barriers, whether they be aristocratic or racial barriers or whatever they might be, and protects things that allow for that opportunity. It gives rise to another very unique concept. That's the concept of the American dream. Again, remember, think about it. Has anyone heard of the French dream? Or the German dream? No, but there is an American dream. Why is that? Because behind the American dream is an exceptional understanding of these principles of a constitutional limited government, and behind that, a notion that we are all the creations of God, and we each are right-bearing creatures. About 100 years ago, there arose another dream, a different dream. And that was the dream that we could make government better. Or excuse me, we could make society better. We could better engineer it through government. Late 1890s, early 1900s, there was an idea that science had evolved, had developed so much that we can now use government to make things better, to change society. to take all the hills and valleys of society and make them all equal, equalize it all. And so a new theory of government arose based on evolving rights, rights that come and go, that change with time, and this concept of a living constitution, which is still the dominant way the Constitution is taught in most law schools. The Constitution is not limited. In principle, it's unlimited. It must be unlimited. Because if rights come and go, the Constitution must adapt to that fact. And that's mostly done by our friends in the Supreme Court. And there's a new theory of government behind it as well. They called it the administrative state. Today we call it the bureaucracy. The idea is that science, knowledge, expertise allows people to run government, to administer it, better than we can administer it, because they can better understand evolving rights in the living Constitution. You see, the modern progressive view of government is a denial of self-government. In the end, what it is a belief that we are not capable of governing ourselves. And we're better to be governed by bureaucrats, those who can run things more efficiently. Now, we see this, of course, playing out over the course of the 20th century. First comes into being under the New Deal, the creation of the beginnings of the welfare state, but especially the Great Society, the explosion of this idea that government, especially the federal government, centralized federal government, is a better way to do things. So now the federal government is in charge of what? Cleaning the air, running the schools, solving all of our problems, and fighting a war on poverty. The current administration has doubled down on that model. Stimulus spending is a reintroduction, a revival of Keynesian economics. Right? The best way to create jobs is through government spending. And of course, the centerpiece of it all is the Obamacare legislation, which has virtually nothing to do with health care. Right? We must rid ourselves of that assumption. The first legislation in the U.S. Federal government, federal legislation, concerning health care was in what year? You start working yourself backwards, right? It wasn't under Jimmy Carter, although he proposed it. It wasn't under the Great Society, although that was proposed then. It wasn't in the 1940s, although Truman and FDR both proposed health care legislation. The first legislation I can find was about 1908. It was in the Progressive Platform of 1912, which would say that the idea that government, the federal government, should administer health care in the United States is an idea that comes at the very beginning of the progressive movement. It's an administrative idea, not a health care idea. It's based on a theory of government that the purpose of government is to administer things. And health, like education, like major components of the economy itself, has always been, the control of those things has always been a core objective of progressivism. Not because of your health care, but because health is something that has to be administered for the sake of progress. For much of modern 20th century history, the view of politics, accepted clearly by the left, and more by many on the right, meaning Republicans, was that politics was about change and progress on the one hand, followed by momentary periods of acceptance, ebb and flow, right? Consolidation, change, progress, consolidation, change, progress, consolidation. But politics never fundamentally questioned the direction of government, which say it was largely assumed that the progressive project, you could slow it down or you could speed it up, but it was on its way, and this was all inevitable. But I would suggest to you that that's actually changed now. What has happened right now with the rise of the Tea Party movements and other things is that I think there is now in the country a large segment of the population who have suggested that we want to question the very premise of this idea. And it turns out that while the left largely assumed that all of this is inevitable and can't be turned around and can't be changed, most Americans, many Americans, perhaps a governing majority of Americans, don't think so. They've never quite fundamentally accepted the liberal premise. The Tea Party, in many ways, is a new phenomenon. It's a rising phenomenon, but it's not, on the other hand. What it is a representation of that aspect of American opinion that has never accepted this argument, but is not engaged in politics, because most of the time they want to spend their lives doing what people normally spend their lives doing. But it's also not a new phenomenon completely. It very much represents, I think, the instincts that came out under the Reagan Revolution. In many ways, Reagan Democrats. There's certain aspects of Pro's independent movement in it as well. But it also goes back even earlier than that. There has been rising over the course of the 20th century, during this inevitable rise of liberalism, an alternative argument. You can go back to one of my favorite presidents, Calvin Coolidge, a great critic of progressivism. There have always been critics of this argument. It starts out slowly, it starts building, it's more responsive to various flows of liberalism, right? The modern conservative movement, which Morton and others are so important, right, has been a response to that. And so what we have now is that intellectual movement, that political movement, that organized movement now has on top of it a deep grassroots movement of Americans who are now coming to the fore because they have not accepted this either. Which suggests to me that we've come to a moment where this battle between the American founders and the progressives, or as I like to say, between two great graduates of Princeton College, James Madison and Woodrow Wilson, has been engaged. It has been engaged in our politics, which is a very unusual thing that rarely happens. But every once in a while, there's a decisive moment, a watershed moment, in which the American people re-engage and look back to core principles. And I think that's where we're at. And that's going to happen. Because this nation fundamentally, always, at its core, is defined by these principles. And the reason why, at the end of the day, I think liberalism loses the battle is because for all they have done over the course of the 20th century, for all they have tried to accomplish, they must now understand that their ideas go against the core undercurrents, the deep undercurrents of what America is. And the American people have now engaged in that argument. In addition to all of the arguments coming from great conservative thinkers, from think tanks, from institutions that have been building up the last 40 or 50 years, when the American people engage in that question, I think the table has changed. We're now in open field politics. It's unclear what's going to happen. We don't know what the outcome will be. America remains an experiment. I am very hopeful because now, perhaps as never before, the American people have engaged. And on that, I think we can have great hope. As I do, that we go forward knowing that in this fight, the right people are on the right side. And I think it's now our task to try to remain engaged as never before on these questions, change the very direction of our country, to change its trajectory, to solve its major problems, to fix the large questions we have about its spending and its debt, but more importantly, get it back on the road of limited constitutional government. I think this task is probably the hardest thing we have ever faced as a people. This is a task that is like those faced by our greatest statesmen. But I think it is the task and the noble obligation of this generation. So, thank you.
Well, what a magnificently eloquent presentation we have just heard. You notice he was looking out, he wasn't reading anything. And he forgot his teleprompter. Um, and the fact is that you could transcribe what he said and publish it, and it would be very high quality. It was quite remarkable. And Matt has agreed to answer questions, and we will now see if there are any people who have questions or comments. Yes.
In October 2004, this fine man served at the George Washington Man of the Millennium Book Festival some years ago, Dr. Spalding, and did an excellent job about his Sacred Citizens book. Anyway, but there is a discussion, the architecture of the federal judiciary, and one of the things we haven't learned in our public school. Anyway, is that we have a bicameral legislature, the House and the Senate, and we have a bicameral judiciary with the jury and the judge, very comparable structure. And yet we, since 47, we have been basically citizens banned from access to the grand jury on the federal level, very much the same thing on the state level. And jury use has declined 24% nationally and 50% in 10 years in Virginia, and over 69% from the 1999 to 2008. Can part of the process of controlling the government be citizens getting back involved with the grand jury process to hold government servants accountable to obey the law?
The question was about juries. First of all, let me confirm your premise. The concept of the jury is actually a wonderful idea we inherited from British constitutionalism. The Americans, in many ways, perfected. In the early republic, a jury, especially a local jury, had a very radical concept, which is that the job of the jury was not only to decide the fate of the accused, but it was actually to interpret the law, which is to say that a jury had wide powers, and precisely was created for that purpose, to place the hand of this judicial application in the hands of citizens. That power has been broken down over the years, very much so. It'd be a very good thing to revive a sense of juries. Now, a federal grand jury works differently than a local jury. Right? They just in the nature of the law and the nature of how it operates. So you'd have to figure out how to do that differently. But having said that, I would generally agree with you. Having said that, one general point I would make is that I think one of the things we need to do today is think about how we strategically decide which of these things we want to emphasize. If I were to start making a list of all the things I think would need to be changed to make these effects happen, it would be rather lengthy. I would love to get rid of the popular election of senators, for instance, 17th Amendment. Having said that, I will also be the first to acknowledge that we have to be political and strategic, and so it wouldn't necessarily be the first thing on my list. We need to decide what are the things that have to be gone after. Where are the places in the modern state where you can pull out a piece or insert something that causes it to collapse? Is that changing how the jury system works? Probably not, although that's something we want to do. We need to figure out how we go after those things. When it comes to the courts, I'm actually of the opinion that the thing we need to revive, and don't get me wrong, I'm in favor of appointing better judges and fighting all those battles, but I think the thing that needs to be revived is a sense of what is called coordinate branch construction, which is that we have three branches of government. All three have an equal responsibility and duty to interpret and uphold the Constitution. Congress, I think, has completely given away its authority when it comes to constitutional powers. I spent a lot of my time trying to get Congress as a body to reinvigorate its constitutional powers, to challenge the administration, to challenge the courts, to not sit back and allow the courts to do what they do. the Madisonian concept of the separation of powers, the checks and balances, right? Madison thought that was the key to limited government. And I think we need to focus on those things, keeping in mind all those other things we want to do. But part of our challenge is to think strategically. What are the real things that would make a difference? But I do agree with your point.
I'm Howie Lynn. Thank you very much, sir, for that great description of our classic struggle. I kind of call that good versus evil, to put it.
One could put it in those terms, I think.
That's right. But as we see every day, the struggle that goes on, I mean, the other side is represented by huge forces in our society: academia, the liberal media, the Hollywood, the liberal judiciary. How do you see us, the good, really conquering those huge forces in our society?
No, look. The fact of the matter is the left still controls, the elite institutions, and they will for some time. As I don't mean to diminish that or not recognize that effect, but keep two things in mind here. They've controlled those institutions for how long? A long time, and they've not won. I mean, this is a phenomenal thing when you think about it. The American character, I think, must be, really strong. It's withstood this onslaught. So that gives you hope, for one thing. The second thing is that I think we have to be mindful of all the ways in which those old institutions are breaking down, in the ways in which things are happening that change their solidity. Think of technology and the internet. Right? The form of communication is destroying all the media institutions the left controls. And there are more and more that are not controlled by the left. The free flow of information has radically changed that institution. Think of education, higher education especially. I mean, if you're looking for the next bubble, it's in higher education, the cost of higher education. But there are now all sorts of ways in which that is breaking down. More internet education is occurring. More institutions are becoming competitive in those markets. Now, that's going to take a while to play out, absolutely. But I think our job is to keep in mind that, where do you go? Where is your strength? You want to continue making that strong. Where are the opportunities to reach out? Where do things come up that allow you to make advances forward, and go forward, and move that way? I'm always reminded, I recall that during the American Revolution, John Adams famously observed that about a third of the colonists were Tories, wanted to stay with the British. About a third or less were revolutionaries, wanted to go with the revolution. And about a third in the middle didn't care. What we want to focus on is those that are the revolutionaries, and then reach out to those that don't care. The third that are committed on the other side, we want to kind of block them as much as possible. But right now, in the midst of this, I'm not worried about changing their opinions. Our objective is to save the country. So you take your third and you turn it into a majority, and go from there. The long road, the long term, in the long term, I think those institutions are bound to collapse, just by sheer inertia at a certain point, or by replacement. I think a place like a Harvard is probably lost. The big universities that have massive endowments. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that's a big loss to myself.
If you return to this idea of self-governance, and I truly believe the government has gotten way too big, but how do you answer the people who are going to make the argument very powerfully on the other side that there are certain segments in our society that can't care for themselves and therefore need government to do it? I'm thinking of the commercials on the radio about the needy children and things like this.
The question is how do you the American argument of self-government has never been this concept of laissez-faire, right? The left is going to demagogue this till the cows come When we say limited government, when we say self-government, when we say constitutional, anything like that, the left immediately says what that means is you want to withdraw everything and let the wild jungle take over. Right? It's survival of the fittest. That's never been the argument. That's the left's kind of straw man they've created. And we can't let them get away with that. The left is engaging now in class warfare, and we've got to aggressively respond to that. If you want to see a good response to that, by the way, I would encourage you. Last week, Paul Ryan gave a great speech at Heritage on this very concept, which is how you turn that issue, how you turn it around. The real class warfare in America is not economic class warfare. The real warfare is because a class of bureaucrats and experts are running our lives. Right? That's how you turn it on them. But my other point is that look, the battle here is not between doing everything for people who need and doing nothing. The battle is between the claim that government is, in principle, fundamentally unlimited and can do anything and everything, and everyone has a right to anything they want. And an argument over on the other side, which is that no, government is limited. We want to govern ourselves, which means the way we're going to do it as much as possible is without government and through markets and things like that. But that does not mean that legislators at the appropriate level of government, which means especially at the state and local level, can't choose as a legislative matter to care for those who can't take care of themselves. We're a compassionate people. We've always done that. You know, the founders had poor laws and dealt with poverty. This is not out of the ordinary. It's a distinction, it's a matter of principle. Right? The left says, as a matter of principle, you have a right to all these things, which means you command the rest of the country to pay for it. That's what we object to. It does not mean we can't, as a people, right, through the democratic process, make decisions and do things within the parameters of the powers of government, especially at the appropriate level, to have programs to take care of these problems. There's always been a safety net in American politics. Now, the preference of that is that safety net is mainly civil society. One of the things government should do is encourage civil society institutions, say religions, and churches, and charities, and institutes, right? But then I have nothing wrong at the local level for communities to have laws that take care of those who truly can't take care of themselves. That can be done within the parameters of this. But the left, again, is they're going to demagogue this to the end of the day. I'll give briefer answers.
Thank you. I'm Jerry Cave, and I rarely remember learning more in less time than I did with your remarks. Thank you. Although I predict that in the future you may have to delineate the difference between Keynesian economics and Herman Keynesian economics. At least
We'll call them Hermanomics. How about that?
Only the Hohenzollerns and Habsburgs have ruled longer than the Democrats have ruled in Maryland. I think the Hohenzollerns did better. But we don't have much redress in Maryland politics. And at this time, our governor is literally making economic war on the private sector, but especially on the rural areas of Maryland, with his tax policy and fee policy and his planning. I mean, it's literally like making war, and we can always vote with our feet and leave, which a lot of businesses and people are doing. But I was thinking that perhaps we could do almost like the civil rights thing, which is to get the federal government to help us maintain our ability to have self-government in the western and eastern parts of Maryland. And I'm like, boy, that doesn't sound very states' rights to me, but we are desperate. So if you had any comments in that regard, I'd appreciate it.
Well, first of all, I will confirm your argument about tyranny in Maryland. I mean, I think the problem we face is that as you start pushing for a decentralization of government, right, as this goes forward at the federal level, that's actually going to free up more states to do their own things, which means you're going to have some states that are going to do bad things. That's a dilemma for those that live in those states. I will readily recognize that fact. Part of that is the nature of our political system and how we have chosen to set that up, which I think is a virtue, and goes back to Madison's notion of what I call dynamic federalism, which is that the virtue of having these states out there is that they compete and they do different things and they have models, good and bad. And the good models win out, at least in theory. That's a high cost for people who are in those states that have bad policies. I would be very reluctant, and I would be extremely careful. There might be ways in which the federal government could step in some ways to block certain actions by the state. I mean, the idea that the precedent of setting that sets really does cut both ways. So I don't know if there's a particular you have in mind, but I'd have to think long and hard about that. I think, oddly enough, we're in a position that where Madison was in the late 1790s, early 1800s, in which you're trying to institute and instigate as much opposition as possible to a massive federal violation of the Constitution. And that's going to happen differently in different states. In some states, it's going to be very aggressive in the right direction. In some states, you're going to be fighting a rearguard action. But you're kind of constantly trying to stir up opposition in a larger movement. And that larger movement, which ultimately right now is focused on opposing Obamacare, but which is really going to change the regime, that then I think has effects down the road. So, my recourse to a place like Maryland is you're playing a long game.
It isn't just a war of words, unfortunately. I haven't seen violence in this country like we're seeing now. And I'm wondering if...
I mean, the Occupy Wall Street
starting in Madison,
nonsense.
Wisconsin, it's demonstrations
Right.
of violence. Are we headed toward some kind of civil war between these ideologues on one side and freedom on the other side, as we were in 1861?
My answer is no. And here's why. I actually strongly favor the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is to say, let them show how absurd they are. Right? I mean, these people are being arrested at high rates. There are now videos all over the net. There's one that just came out about someone pushing a motorcycle police officer off his bike. They're being arrested for drug use, for defecation in public places. It's just amazing. I mean, let 1,000 flowers wilt, right? This is where the free market of ideas wins, I think. I think it's just patently obvious that these people are not representative of the American people. Now, what the left wants to do is instigate the kinds of opposition and activities that are going on in Greece and Spain and other countries. But again, I think the left has fundamentally misread the American character. Class warfare does not work here. We are not a class-based society. And the thing that struck me about this is the whole Occupy Wall Street thing was going on, taking off, and within that same first week is when Steve Jobs died. And so here are all these protesters protesting out there with their Apple communications devices, but they're praising Steve Jobs. Well, Steve Jobs was a billionaire 8 times over. I think there's a certain way in which there's an obvious answer to this. Let it go. Let the American people watch it. Because at the end of the day, they come down the side of Steve Jobs. They like Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, he's kind of a liberal. He supported democratic cause. But what he did, right, truly represents the American dream. And this guy was illegitimately born, through into adoption, adopted by parents. You've heard this story. He creates Apple. We want more Steve Jobs. We want more. If that's what a billionaire, we want more of those billionaires. Right? So I think this Occupy Wall Street stuff is just nonsense.
Last question.
I'm going to just say, I want to take Dr. Spalding This book, I want everybody in this room to get this book and read it. It is fantastic. It's called We Still Hold These Truths. It was given to me by a young man in Johnson City, Tennessee. He's a teacher of economics in high school. And I haven't been able to put it down. I finished it last night at 11:30. And I
So
can't.
you read the story of Joseph Warren.
I read the story of Joseph. Yes, I did. And I outlined it, I underlined it. I'm going to go back and read it again. So with the closing of that, I want to say, everybody, get the book. Dr. Spalding
appreciate
has
that.
got
Thank
a
you very much.
real winner there. Thank you very much for
Thank you.
speaking.
Thank you.
Hold up here just one moment. Well, what a wonderful presentation, and what a wonderful man we have here. Now, it is generally our practice to hand out to our speakers here an Adam Smith tie or an Adam Smith scarf, whichever may be appropriate. But I've noticed that there are ties from Heritage Foundation, and so while I'm sure Adam Smith ties are not unacceptable in the Heritage Foundation, a lot of people wear Heritage ties. So we're going to present to you, Matt, as a token of our appreciation, a set of Adam Smith cufflinks. Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you all to join us on Wednesday, December 7th. Hopefully not a day that will live in infamy this year. Our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast will be then, and our guest speaker will be one of the most competent and effective conservative organizational leaders in the country. And his name is Mark Mix. He is president of the National Right to Work Committee and the National Right to Work Foundation, a magnificent organization, and I urge you to come join us then. And now, anyone who is interested in a tour of the Leadership Institute building here and a tour of our addition in the building next door should come up to the lectern here, and David Talbot will be happy to give you the tour. And here is David. He will give a great tour. Thank you all very much.